everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Architecture Foundation 100-Day Studio event. This is day 70 and our second event in the series. It's hosted by Black Females in Architecture, BFA, and on the topic of decolonizing architecture, with a specific focus on diversifying the profession. Just gonna wait for our slides to pop up. Great. So our last event focused on decolonizing the architecture education system. And if you haven't seen it, you are able to review it on the Architecture Foundation's YouTube channel in your own time. And my name is Neba Sere. I'm one of the co-founders of BFA, and I'm joined tonight by Umi Baden-Powell, who is the host for tonight, as well as myself. And we're also joined by our BFA admin, who will be your point of contact if you want to direct any questions to the panel. And we're asking you to do that after we're opening up to the panel. So before we start, I'd like to, next slide please, just walk you through our code of conduct. So we understand that tonight will be a discussion, and any opinions expressed here are not representative of everyone's view. We trust that everyone will be helping to build an inclusive and welcoming environment, and critique is welcomed, but we condone naming names or attacking anybody directly. This is about listening tonight and valuing the fact that everyone here is an expert of their own experiences, and any form of discrimination is not acceptable, and participants will be immediately ejected if this should occur. Next slide, a little bit about BFA. We are a membership organization of 300 plus members globally, and our aim is to increase the visibility of Black and Black mixed heritage women within the built environment industry. We advocate for diversity through inclusive and exclusive talks, events, workshops, and projects. And in terms of today's schedule, we only have an hour, so we've tried to pack a lot into this hour. We'll start with an audio-visual collage that we'll ask you to listen to. Then hear from our invited panelists. Next slide, please. Joseph Henry, David Ogunmuyiwa, Tara Gbolade, and Pedro Gil. And we'll then continue with an open discussion where we'll invite you to join us. So if you have any questions, please then send them into the chat as an open question, or if you want to do that privately, that's possible to direct it to our BFA admin. So during this session, we'll also hear comments from our keynote listeners towards the end of the event. And these keynote listeners are invited to reflect upon what they have heard tonight, respond and potentially declare pledges or any commitments, as these are people from large-scale architecture firms or organizations. And beyond the confines of the hour that we have today, we hope that the keynote listeners will be inspired to use their power and influence to make lasting change and impact for the better. So for the audience, we're really keen for you to feel comfortable joining this conversation. So you're very free to turn off your cameras and anonymize your Zoom name if you wish to do so. Please take note of any questions you have, as we'll be opening up the floor after the discussion, as I said. So yeah, if you have any questions, please send them to us into the chat inbox. You're able to click on the chat in the middle of the screen, and then that will pop up. And after the panelists have contributed, we will then ask you to come in with your comments. So because this is a collective discussion, it would be great if you could share your comments yourself. you know, in your own words, that'd be great. But we also understand that if there's a sensitive issue, you can do that privately to a BFA admin. So yes, we also have basically created an after Zoom informal event space because this is just an hour, and we were quite we realized at the last event that people were quite keen to continue the conversation, so you're more than welcome to join that. Of course, we will drop the chat, the Zoom into the chat, the Zoom link into the chat. So I'm gonna pass over to Umi to introduce herself, and then our research and the audiovisual collage.
Hey, hi everyone. So I'm Umi Baden-Powell. I'm an architectural designer and activist, and I'm a director of a emerging studio called Insider Outsider. We're interested in design from the position of an outsider. So we design with marginalized people and communities to tackle social, environmental, and spatial injustices. Both Neba and myself have a shared passion for enabling underrepresented and diverse and inclusive voices from communities to shape and interrogate education, practice, and the built environment itself. So now we're going to move on to the audio visual collage. I'm going to have to just switch my screen sharing to enable me to present a video. But before we start the conversation, we'd just like to say a really big, huge thank you, and that we're really grateful to the individuals who have taken the time and emotional effort to reflect and share some notes with us. We'd encourage you to all listen intently, and maybe you might even like to close your eyes for a deeper listening experience and a more kind of empathic connection to some of the stories described. So I'm just gonna switch screens now, just bear with me 1 second. Here we go.
When I started off training as an architect, all I wanted to do was train as an architect. It was my experience that forced me to realize that actually I'm being treated differently. It was something that was imposed on me by my education. And kind of frustratingly in a way, I've had to kind of develop into a kind of professional ethnic minority, an activist, when all I wanted to do was be an architect. This is kind of shit, if you like, that you have to deal with. It isn't stuff that I'm not trying to be a Black Panther or anything. I'm just trying to be an architect.
I didn't know why I was not getting any interviews, even though I had had so many applications to so many different practices. At some point, I suspected it may have something to do with my name. I got married and my husband's got a very English-sounding name. I joked with him that the minute I changed my name, I would get a job. Lo and behold, I got a job interview after changing my name, after 6 months of not even a single response.
So my experiences in practice, walking into an interview to be told, I didn't expect you to be Black, followed up by, we were looking for somebody else with more experience.
And as soon as I got to the interview, I was waiting in the reception, and as soon as the director came out and saw me, he looked at his watch and said he only had 30 minutes. It was clear that I wasn't who he was expecting me to be.
This lack of diversity ultimately hurts everyone. The profession is not really welcoming, and it's almost monoculture.
Low expectations. Very, very, very low expectations of you. You walk in and people just assume that you're a lot younger than you actually are. And it becomes quite degrading when someone that is like 5-6 years younger than you thinks that you're younger than them, with less experience than them.
I was just doing his work, like all of his admin stuff, all of his dirty work. I did all his work, basically. So I didn't have time to work on my skills or do all the other stuff that everyone else was doing. And when I say everyone else, I would say like majority of like the white graduates. I'm not going to just be doing printing and shit for everyone or trying to find like bookings, because that's not my role, right?
It's here that I started to pick up on all the issues relating to how offices treat you as a contractor, how people treat you as a junior member of staff, and also the challenges of being the only black person wearing religious dress and not being a part of the usual drinks and socials because of this.
Just a negative attitude, just a very negative, unwelcoming attitude where people just don't think you belong.
I had a colleague who once said to me that I look like somebody who would work in the kitchen, even though he knew that I was an architectural assistant and urban designer. There was another occasion where a consultant came in and shook everybody's hand at the meeting and skipped me.
It's not the hierarchy that makes talking about these issues difficult. It's the clear discomfort shown if the word race or black or brown is mentioned, the silence that ensues. If management is uncomfortable talking about these issues or saying these words, can you imagine how much harder that is for me?
I had to ask HR at my current practice to review a company policy that prohibited BAME staff from returning to the office due to concerns that BAME people are more likely to contract and spread coronavirus. When it came to job offers, on quite a few occasions, I would be shortlisted. I would be down to me and one other person. Most of the time was me and one other white person. And for some reason, I'd be told that they had to go with the other candidate.
And she did treat the other person on the project completely different to how she treated me. Consequently, I left because I just felt it wasn't a place which was nurturing and loving. It was actually the opposite. And it did traumatize me.
The teacher approached a student of a Caribbean ethnic minority, and his first reaction to the student not having new work was to ask him if he was sure architecture was meant for him and if he had pressure from his family to do this and that he might be better doing something else. You know, in the same session, a white student of English Heritage had a similar problem, and he approached that student and his reaction was quite different. One, that he asked him how can he support him. He offered some books, offered some direction as to what could, jolt the student into making progress with the project.
Just after qualifying at my end of year review, instead of creating some targets and goals to assist me in the next stage of my career, I was greeted with an extremely hostile situation of blaming and accusations and proposed to put me on a performance review for 3 months. This essentially put me back on probation without my expected pay rise. After being there for a whole year, having no prior conversations about my performance, and being blindsided completely at a time when I should be celebrating and gaining more confidence. It's these types of scenarios that really knock your confidence and make you question whether you belong in this industry.
We were given the opportunity to gain a career grade level upgrade, and I applied for this. However, when I did apply for this, this is when the real pushback happened. At this point, I realized that this was a form of systemic racism that I was experiencing and that I needed to get out of this organization.
I was told to choose because of some perception that pursuing my interests, that perhaps I wasn't loyal to the profession. Eventually, I did choose, and at that point in time, I didn't choose architecture.
In an award application, amongst other attributes, my practice claimed to be diverse and supportive to all. I emailed the studio member who had said this to explain that the studio is not diverse. We have no black people, and I am one of the few people of color, and I do not have any support from anyone senior in dealing with consequential issues.
My toxic experiences actually happened at an organisation that prides themselves for being inclusive.
For the over 6 months that I was applying for the job, for a job when I moved back to the UK, I worked in retail. I remember meeting up with my friends who were in jobs in architectural practices and moving up and moving to director positions. And they'd ask me what I was doing, and it was a horrible feeling. It was a really, really difficult time. I didn't see what the difference was with me and them and why I wasn't able to get the same opportunities. I think at the time I didn't want to believe that was the reason, because it's easier to believe that maybe it's my experience or something wrong with my applications, as opposed to the fact that the color of my skin is what's the barrier, because I can't change the color of my skin. But if it's something in my application, I feel more power to change that. So this last experience was something I find really difficult to talk about. I still experienced a lot of trauma and fear from that time. So I worked for a company for a number of years. However, there was a bullying culture in the management. I decided to leave and find another role, and that was not dealt with very well. I spent a horrible number of weeks working out my notice with a lot of tension, being ignored and being mistreated. And to this day, I still can't reference that company because they've decided to not acknowledge the hard work that I put in. I think the sad thing is I now see online that particular place talking about how they support Black Lives Matter and how they're going to do better, but I've never had an apology. A lot of Black women's labour taken, but no acknowledgement of it. But here they are at the forefront talking about how Black Lives Matter, and yet my Black life was not significant to them, and neither did they support me. So it's really difficult because a lot of companies are paying the lip service, but it will be interesting to really scrutinize whether that's being practiced, whether their past injustices have been acknowledged, and whether they are really changing.
If the client who writes the brief isn't people from the communities that the brief will affect, then it's bound to just not represent those interests. And I think it doesn't matter then if a Black architect delivers that brief or not. It just makes it a more palatable face, essentially. It's really cosmetic. It goes so deep. It's not enough. Just because you have a Black architecture practice delivering whatever project for whatever borough, it doesn't necessarily mean that the project is therefore not hugely problematic and marginalising. A lot of Black architects, people from BAME backgrounds, want to think about these things and think about them differently.
As a profession, we are failing this. We are failing society. Society's just left us behind because we haven't adapted. We don't reflect society. Going back to what somebody said before about how can we make this a kind of broader church and bring the sort of the gatekeepers with us. Well, if they can't see by now, they are actually irrelevant to society, increasingly irrelevant to society, and they're not going to adapt and try to adopt different points.
So a huge thank you to all the contributors for taking the time to go back to these experiences, talk about them and share them with us. They were happy to put them into a public and open domain to be discussed, which I find very generous. So due to time constraints, the audio-visual collage was very fast-paced, we know. So if you wanted to digest and let it sink in, you'll be able to do that while we move on to the panelists. But also this will be uploaded to online, so you can go back and listen to it in your own time. So I'm going to pass over to Umi to introduce the event's panelists.
Just moving on to the slides again. So thank you for everyone kind of who's been contemplating what we've just shared. I think it brings up a lot for a lot of people, and it can sometimes be quite difficult to kind of process some of these things. So again, yeah, just to kind of reiterate the kind of huge gratitude for that. I hope that everyone's kind of able to, likewise take some time to think about that, maybe review it again in the future. Moving on to our brilliant speakers who have very generously also joined us today. And what we've asked our speakers to do is to reflect on how they've addressed, or maybe even feel the need to address, diversifying the profession. And also think about how this process connects with the decolonising architecture movement. This could be by outlining examples, anecdotes, or provocations around themes such as finding a job after graduating, to accessing practice, or even to the barriers for BAME-led businesses in gaining the opportunities to build, particularly around procurement, which has been discussed heavily in recent architectural press. So this reflection could also be movements or projects to tackle the diversity crisis, with our panelists describing how and why they've set that initiative, or how they've been involved in it. So speaking this evening, we have today with us Joseph Henry, who's an urbanist and educator. He works as a senior project officer at the Greater London Authority in the regeneration team. And he's also an area lead for projects in Newham, Tower Hamlets, Hackney and the City of London. He is also a co-host with Pooja Agrawal of the platform Sound Advice. And then we have David Ogunmuyiwa, who runs the architecture and urban design practice Architecture Doing Place, which specialises in social housing and arts projects. David's worked as a frontline housing officer in some of London's toughest boroughs before retraining as an architect, playing in pivotal roles on many multi-award-winning schemes. And then we have the brilliant Tara Gbolade, who is co-founder of the award-winning Gbolade Design Studio, winner of the Reba J Rising Star Award. Her practice specialises in residential and mixed-use developments for public and private sector clients in urban and suburban settings. Their practice specialises in insight-led sustainable placemaking. And finally, Pedro Gil. Pedro's an architect and senior teaching fellow at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL. He's also a member of the RIBA Expert Advisory Group, Agents for Change. This is the steering group which advises the RIBA on matters relating to equality, diversity and inclusion. His interests lie in blending the creative process of crafting buildings with subtleties of designing for people, places and communities, and he's the founding director of Studio Gil. So first of all, firstly, just to try and make your comments and contributions between 2 to 3 minutes, and we can say a little bit more once we open things up to the audience at 6 o'clock. So first of all, over to you, Joseph. You should be unmuted now.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I'm just gonna end the sharing screen so that you can go big.
Oh, great. Yeah, it was interesting. What interesting. Just like listening to that when I was thinking about what to say today. It sort of brought me back to why myself and Pooja set up Sound Advice, and why we didn't really set it up. It came to us because we were asked to do some writing for After Party, and we sort of wrote some experiences in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way. We did a survival guide for BAME architects, how to behave in a predominantly white profession. And then what we realised after publishing it was how many people had to share that experience. It's like I don't like talking about this like universal Black experience, but the universal Black experience is suffering racism, unfortunately. That's the sort of one thing that ties us together. Every single person that we've spoken to about our Sound Advice publication have experienced one, if not multiple, of the experiences that we wrote about. And I could sort of like think, well, why is that? Like, why is it that it's so normal for people of colour to experience this in our industry? And I think it's because the behavior of racism is so normalized. Like it's a social norm that we've become accustomed to, that it's not unacceptable. And I think that it's a massive hangover from my like imperialist past. And often the rebuke to that was a really long time ago. But I was born with the name of the family that owned my family. And my family, my mum announced in that family name. But most of my cousins still walk around with the Eccleston name attached to them. And the people that owned my family were Edward and Margaret Eccleston. We found them. They got reparations worth £13,000 from the British government when slavery was abolished. They owned 5 slaves. One of them was a slave called Betty, who was 12 years old, we found in the records. And I went on Ancestry.com recently, and I could search back in about 5 minutes, 9 generations of my Welsh family, partly because they all stayed in Wales and they literally never travelled outside of like southern Wales. And then I could only trace back 3 generations of my Jamaican family. Because after my granddad, Leopold Augustus Lewin, who was born in 1908 to Elizabeth and David Lewin, his grandparents were property. So you can't find them. They don't have birth certificates. They don't exist. And because the Lewins were big slave owners, we don't know which of those property were people. But it's in living memory. So I met someone whose family members, whose grandparents who looked after him as a child, were born enslaved. So this isn't a very long time ago. And a lot of the institutions that we work in or hold power or have positions of authority, institutions were set up in that time. So the behavior is really pervasive. I think until people have the courage to change their behaviors, these things will continue. And now I work in commissioning. You see that behavior all the time. I remember I was we were sitting around the table for a culture institution in East London, an institution that's designed for ethnic minorities. I was the only, myself and an artist, I won't say her name, I was to give away the institution. On a table of 6 people commissioning, or maybe 7 people commissioning, there were only 2 ethnic minorities. An architect led by a person of colour came in and presented their project, which was by far the best interview I've ever seen an architect give. It was outstanding. And one of the people around the table who worked for the local authority in question turned around and said, well, he's just obviously too cool for this role. No description of his quality of the proposal. And what I realized, that then allowed everyone else to jump in with their prejudicial views about how he was too cool, or he was too arrogant, or he spoke too much. It's the presentation where you're supposed to talk about your work. He spoke too much. And I feel really ashamed that I didn't say anything then, because I felt so isolated that I didn't have the power. But that was about a month or 2 months after I started my role at the GLA. Now, what I've realized about sitting around these tables is actually most people are quite mediocre and they're not supreme to me anymore. They're just normal people. So my pledge, because I feel like it's important, is that I will never not speak up when I need to. And I think and then the other thing that I realize is how repetitive this is. David will probably talk about this, but the last person, other than Tower Hamlets Council, who are an exception to the rule, to commission a Black architect to do public housing in London was my mum in 1992. And I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Joseph. And moving on to David, if you'd like to unmute yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. And yeah, I can only concur with everything that everyone said and just how affecting the montage was. But I think everybody of color on this kind of in this event recognizes a lot of those experiences. So just really quickly, I intend to just focus on what I try and do outside of practice, which is focusing on a thriving ecosystem of Black-led and BAME-led practitioners. And that's not because I'm altruistic in any way. I like to think I'm a nice person, but it's not because I'm altruistic. But it's because if it's not novel to employ me, then I can compete. At the moment, I'm othered, and there's a notable competition that's just been announced this week, which has, based on a track record of literally years, at least half a decade of not employing any Black architects, has then asked Black architects to compete for one role. So rather than just picking up the phone and asking for a quote from Black architects, they've asked them to compete together to get one role at the table in one of the most diverse boroughs, not just in London, but in Europe. So I'll just leave that there. But some of the excuses, I've been looking at this for a few years. So I did 66 freedom of information requests in 2016 to kind of demonstrate an evidence base, because one of the things you know as a black person is just because you say something doesn't mean people listen to you clearly. So you need evidence. You need to demonstrate things, and you need to get figures. Otherwise, people will take you even less seriously. I mean, they barely take you seriously when you've got the figures. So one of the things that's come out of that are kind of four categories, four clear buckets of lazy excuses that people give. And I just want to scrutinize that in the kind of context of some decisions, very public decisions that have happened recently in London boroughs, and some that are about to be announced very shortly, which is talking about the lack of diversity in practitioners as an access problem and not a supply problem. And the interesting thing about an access problem is it's somebody else's fault. So if you say there aren't enough black architects, that makes it the profession's fault alone. The profession does have that problem, it's true. But there are certainly many out there that people just need to go and find. This isn't just unique to architecture, it's kind of a problem that black people find in all walks of life. But if it's a supply problem, then it's the gatekeeper's problem. It basically makes them reflect on choices that they are making or not making, and kind of decisions and situations like Joseph has just outlined. And those not enoughs, really quickly, are: one, there's not enough of you; two, you're not experienced enough; three, you're not trying hard enough. So I call that the shaming, not enough. Which is also kind of can also be framed as just keep doing what you've always been doing, just keep plugging away, and magically what hasn't happened for 20 years is spontaneously going to happen tomorrow. And then number four is you're not good enough. And just really quickly before I let you go, I'll talk about that in the context of Professor Dame Athene Donald, who's Master of Churchill College, Cambridge. That's the term she prefers to use. And she's the UK's one of the most kind of preeminent scientists. And she says, when she was talking about research projects she didn't get a chance to do as a woman, what can you say when somebody says that you're not good enough? And the answer is you can't say anything because it's subjective. So by definition, you know, they might be right, who knows? What you can say is over an improbably long period of time, nobody that looks like you has been good enough. And that makes it a them problem, not a you problem. And just to kind of link it back to colonialism, because we're going to talk about decolonizing architecture. I always frame this as a public accounts issue. So no one is doing me a favor in public, in these public organizations. I pay in, okay? I pay council taxes. Everybody on this call pays council taxes. We pay into the system, and that money is taken from us. And on the single proviso, apparently, according to the record, that we cannot bid for it, and we cannot work for it, and we cannot even compete for it in the case of frameworks. So I think that's a kind of thing that actually chimes quite well with the labor and the effort of people, and the kind of the resource of people being put into the pot, and then being redistributed unfairly. So I'll let.
Thank you, David.
Next person go.
All very, very poignant points. Tara, it'd be great to hear from you.
Thank you so much. What I've decided to do is read actually a snippet from a piece that I was asked to write recently, because I think it speaks to a lot of what we've heard, and particularly for the young lady who asked if she belonged in the industry. This is for you. Do not forget your power. You with the midnight skin, from the ingenuity of the Igbos, Nigerians you embody, to the wealth of the Ashantis you adopted, from the wit of the Maasai you personify, to the strength of the mercy that you exemplify, from the fiscal astuteness of the Yorubas you married into, to the leadership of the Zulus you represent, from the queens that you bear, to the kings that you rear. Your rich tapestry of cultures, religions, communities surround you. Yes, you with the midnight skin, your healing diviners and tribal origins directed from your African narratives. Do not forget from where you came. Do not forget your inherent power. When you arrive in the room, do not let them push you out, for you bring this inherent power with you. Your cultural diversity exemplified by your myriad of creative ideas, because you're always piecing the worlds around you together. This not only qualifies you to be in the room, it propels you to sit at that table. You with the midnight skin, who has to navigate the space between and still belong to both ancestral heritage and the world you were born into. a world where you're not seen as equal or heard as loudly, a space where your plan is ignored, where your pain is ignored and your words disbelieved. Never forget your power. Yes, their knees on your neck when you're assumed as not smart because you have a different accent, an African accent. The promotions that have been overlooked, the favoritism not afforded to you, the senior leadership withheld from you for so long that you now do not aspire for it, assumed to be the architectural assistant and not the associate. When you walk into a room, they turned their backs on you. Yes, I noticed that too. Yet you're rolled in under the false pretense of community engagement, so they can parade pictures of you when presenting to clients and show off saying, look, I engage with the one with the midnight skin, yet withhold the design work from you because surely you're incapable. The distrust in them that this breeds in you, the divide it creates when there's potential for deep connection. Dear one, do not let this frustration take away your power. Do not forget your power. Well, they say, if you don't like it, go back to your country. We should therefore ask them to please return the millions of Black slaves they stole from us, because prior to their arrival, we thrived for millennia without their input. We migrated between tribes and traded with equals. Ask them to return London and Liverpool and Bristol, to return the production that formed the foundation of world trade, return their industrial revolution. Also, they should not forget to return the rich cultural arts that they stole. Ah yes, they forget that we are inextricably linked. Do not let that hate that runs in the very structures that hold up the institutions you worked to thrive in stop you. For remember that your name carries weight, a deep meaning that carries with it a destiny every time it is spoken. Do not forget your power. Through death, life evolved. Death has the power to catalyze the creative process, a process they must now be aware is needed. So my dear one with the midnight skin, take up space, laugh as loud as the Lozi from which you descended, dance as joyfully as the Nandi, whose blood runs beneath your skin, live as fearlessly as the Chewa, and be as carefree as the Ihazi. Do not waste your time on the ones who do not understand. Instead, seek to walk alongside the giants who wish to bring change. Yes, my dear one, do not forget your power, because it allows you to be fully authentic. It allows you to thrive in the face of adversity. It allows you to keep fighting the good fights. Do not forget your power. Thank you.
Wow, Tara, thank you. That was incredible. I don't know if you would be able to share a link or copy and paste that into the chat so that people can ruminate on some of the words a little bit more. I know that I would really like to reread and contemplate that. Thank you. And Pedro, if you, it'd be lovely to hear from you as well, please.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Okay. Hi, I'm Pedro Gil, and so I'd like to start by saying thank you to Neba and Umi for setting up this really interesting forum, and to the Architecture Foundation for allowing this the space to have these kind of conversations. So I'm going to speak really about some of my rambling thoughts about being a person of color living and working in a white world. And on that, I'll start that. So I'm a practitioner. I run a practice and it's been going for 11 years. And I've been teaching for slightly longer than that. So I exist in both worlds, in both practice and in academia. And in both those territories, I am very often the only person of color in the room. And at first I didn't notice, but then one day the penny dropped, and it was quite a shocking moment for me, and I kind of relive that moment often on a daily basis, and it gets less shocking because you get more used to it. But the thing that shocks me now is that I'm the only person that's aware that I'm the only person of color in the room. Nobody else seems to notice that. Nobody else seems to acknowledge that. So that's the first point. The second point comes to kind of about how you have to constantly prove yourself. And for a large part of my career, I really believed that if I got my head down, that if I worked hard, that if I kept on going, eventually that breakthrough would come. And and some of my more enlightened peers would say that, but they were, like I was at that stage, oblivious to the race barriers. And they said, oh, Pedro, any day now, it's going to happen, both in practice and in academia. It's going to happen. The work you're doing is so interesting. It's going to blow up. All you need is that one bit of luck. And I would argue that that one bit of luck, 11 years into practice, more years into teaching, still hasn't arrived. Whilst I have had many opportunities, the interesting ones, I've had to magic them up myself. I've had to create projects where there are no projects. I've had to find the client. I've had to join the dots. I've had to take the project to the decision maker, to the funder. I've had to underwrite it. I've had to produce work for free. And once that's done, then I get a small scale commission. Whilst my white peers, who are often, I've taught them, who were often at school with me, at architecture school, I see them flying ahead. Now, this is where I have to check myself and say to myself, how much of this is green-eyed monster Pedro? How much of this is just look internally and keep working hard, keep working hard. But there's only so much that you can continue that mode of working and thinking before the doubt starts setting in. So that's the second thing about always having to over-accomplish and always having to over-prove yourself. So my next point comes into why I set up a practice. So the kind of paradigm or the interesting thing about all of these experiences is why Studio Gil exists. It's because I wasn't getting opportunities, or rather to kind of contextualize it in my own head, in my own space, I wasn't getting the opportunities that I felt I was capable of. So I decided to bet on myself. And quite literally, I was working at a practice and I was made redundant, and I thought to myself, this was literally my thought process. I don't like the idea of my future and my destiny being in the hands of old white men who, frankly, I've got more ability and talent in my little toe. So I'm just going to bet on myself with no clients, with no contacts. I was recently part 3, and off I went. But there is opportunity in that you begin to craft your own autonomy and freedom. And about 2 years in, I kind of pledged to myself about the way I wanted to work and the kind of clients I wanted to work with and the kind of commissions I wanted to take on. And that has allowed me to be able to do things such as represent the underrepresented groups, to give a voice to those that don't typically have a voice. For example, the Latin American community in London and the UK. So I'm of mixed race heritage, Latin American. We are grossly underrepresented. And I've been able to leverage my position as a senior teaching fellow at the Bartlett and as an architect into raising that profile. So the next point I want to talk about is also acknowledging my privilege, that, and like some of my female counterparts, I have benefited and continue to benefit from male privilege, from being a man. So if I was a woman, I'm certain it would be that much harder. Next bit of privilege, my light skin privilege, that if my skin was darker, I'm certain things would be that much harder, the opportunities would be that much harder, which is also something that isn't spoken about. You know, privilege, and the lighter your skin is, the more likely you're going to win that work with a commission. And then my last bit of privilege that I'm very aware of is my Bartlett privilege, that I was very fortunate that the Bartlett School of Architecture let me into its establishment, and I was educated, and I received a world-class education. And I know to this day that is something that I benefit from. So I'm just going to wrap it up because I can see Umi's getting restless.
I'm sorry.
So I'm just going to say that whether we like it or not, whether I like it or not, I am bound by a sense of duty that that I try to speak up whenever I can, that I try to acknowledge my past errors, that I try to acknowledge where I want to be, and acknowledge my working class background, my migrant background, that I come from poverty, and that I want to give back. And on that note, thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Wow, such amazing kind of comments and contributions. Sorry we've had such little time. We've actually started to get quite a few questions in from the audience now, most commonly through private messages. So we're keen to open up the space and the platform for them to kind of be able to kind of discuss some of those things with you and kind of give some of those comments or reflections based on what's been said so far. So I'm just going to hand it over to Neba, who's going to be chairing the discussion now.
Thanks, Umi. So yes, we've opened up to the floor, and as Umi said, we had quite a few private questions. So I'm just going to read them out to the panel and get your responses. So first one was, Tara, your text referred to the giants who support you. Can I ask the panel to tell us about a giant, a mentor, a friend in our profession today that you look for strength and support on BAME issues? I think maybe Tara, that one goes to you.
Okay, that's a difficult one. The giant was a good spot there. So in terms of giants that I look for, I'm not going to lie. I mean, when I was younger and looking for anyone to get some type of guidance at, obviously I looked at people like Zaha Hadid and Elsie Owusu from a distance, and I didn't know them. I've been lucky enough to have had great mentors. I probably wouldn't name them, but they are they've worked in larger practices. It's been white female was one of my most phenomenal mentors, and she helped me, I think, take up space, to be honest. While it wasn't race related, she was just a phenomenal mentor. Now, I mean, certainly what I say to my mentees, I tend to say, well, if you're looking for somewhere to work in, look at the pictures on their on a website of an architectural practices, how many BAME people are in senior leadership. If there aren't any in senior leadership, that's probably another place for you. And I don't make any apologies for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. We also had comments about the feeling of not having any power, even when you arrived in a profession and when you first make it out to practice or to be within an institution. And that was something that, Joseph, you've been speaking about, and that made you think about how much power you have and how you can then speak up about things. So this question is about, can we reconcile change from within a system, or do we always have to work outside of it?
I guess probably both. It's always both. There's power the institution can have to provide opportunities for people, and then people outside the system can then use those opportunities to make change. I think I know that a lot of people definitely you can't work from within the system because the system's inherently corrupt, but they still exist and they still have power. And I guess the traditions that we're working within are quite, they are ones that are going to take time. And it's interesting, just going back to the previous question, I listened to a lot of Dr. Cornel West, as I don't know if people know him, but he always talks about the tradition and the traditions of communities and and a lot of ways institutions are communities. They're a series of people who regulate a behavior. So I think if you can change enough people within those sorts of systems, you can change the behavior of them and make them, I don't want to say more inclusive because I hate that word. They can be less proactively excluding people from those institutions and systems. And then again, back to the previous question, I always have to talk about my mum. She always said to me, it's easier done than said. Like, stop talking about it, just do it. And I think that's probably a good thing, because I think if another institution sets up another working group or discussion group to make change, I will actually kick them down some stairs. Like, it's quite simple what you need to do. And the idea, and I just be very wary of people who try to overcomplicate this, because all it is buying them time. And there's a whole sense that people are going to manage their way out of this crisis, but just to say it's very simple, just do it. So I think institutions will wrap themselves in complex language and like obscene bullshit, and I just have to call it out and just say, no, just do it. Yeah.
Thank you, Joseph. So there's also the question of, once you make it into a possible position of power or bigger institution or organization, there seems to be a fear of not necessarily being able to speak out because you might be scared of losing your position, or not making any friends. I've certainly felt that way myself. So thinking about the fact that you don't want to be the only one in the room, and that you now have the power to change that. But again, if you don't have any allies within that institution, or any people vocal about wanting to see the same change that you want to see, that can be quite precarious. So I think that the other question was about how to ensure that you're not the only one in the room. And I think out of experience, this industry is exclusive, and you get job opportunities not because you apply necessarily, but because you know someone who knows someone. And that's something that I see the BFA community do, or our mentors do, by opening doors for us constantly to be able to get into that room. And that's a duty that Pedro was talking about that I think many of us feel. So I'm gonna actually ask Hannah, one of the young trustees, to come in, because you had a question about the fact that if you don't necessarily have parents who support you in your quest of becoming an architect, because the financial security isn't as great as other professions, especially parents from migrant backgrounds who worked really hard to be where they are and want you to succeed. I think, Hannah, if you are here and you wanted to ask your questions yourself, that'd be great. Otherwise, I'm happy to continue. Just gonna give it a minute. Okay. So yes, how do we ensure that?
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Amazing. Thank you.
I was like, where's the unmute? Hi there. Yeah, actually, I'd be really interested to hear, because David was kind of talking about a supply issue. So I'd love to hear what he thinks about this. So my dad is Arab, he's an immigrant, and I had to really fight to be able to do architecture in the first place, because he thought it was too, picking the arts was too much of an unstable career to choose. And I've had heard similar stories from other friends who have immigrant parents. And I was wondering if, as well as I do lots of work with young people in schools, but if there's a way or thoughts of how to get to parents as well who have a lot of control in the decision making of their academic children. That's just the question I had.
Do you want to direct your question to a specific person on the panel?
I'd be interested what David had to say. He was talking about it not being a supply issue, which I could totally understand. So maybe I'm thinking about this incorrectly.
I'd say none of us are thinking about any of this incorrectly, because these are all very personal kind of experiences for all of us, and our perspectives and ways of looking at it. I think one of the interesting things that I find about that, again, I actually think it's an access issue. So to kind of invert your question, because I think one of the things is, if you can see people like you out there being successful, being kind of amazing, showing excellence. I always think, I was very lucky to always see, as Tara said, to see David Adjaye and Zaha did up there. So the question when I was having conversations with people, or when I was arguing with people, wasn't ever about having to demonstrate excellence, because I could just point to them. And that helped. And there's a thing about a rising tide raises all boats. And I think the more of us that are out there, I really mean this about this kind of thriving ecosystem, the more of us that are out there, the more normalized it is, the easier it is for people like yourselves to be able to demonstrate that to your parents, or people who might be kind of nervous and anxious about a path that you take, and about how it can be productive and how we can kind of contribute in lots of different ways. I think we all need to kind of get the opportunity to be up there and show that no matter where we come from, there are people like us that are interested in these things. You may have had this experience as well if you do stuff in schools, in that I have never been in a single classroom. I mentor widely. I mentor, and I've also been in school. So since I was a kid to now teaching at Portsmouth University, I've never been in a single classroom where at least one child hasn't wanted to be an architect.
Yeah.
Now, whether they know what that means, or whether they're going to go through the whole process, or whether they can make it through the whole process, is a different thing. But it's not fundamentally a lack of people wanting to do the thing. It's fundamentally a lack of access that is a perverse incentive against doing the thing. And I think, almost to kind of shoehorn in my agenda to your agenda, but it is about that thing that it's easier for you to make a case about why you should be doing this thing that's so important to you, that you're passionate about, if you've got more role models and people to point to and say, it's not such a strange thing. You might be a bit nervous about it, but it's still possible. And I think that's kind of the best answer I can give to that.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Hannah, for asking your question as well. So there's a comment about someone working in a practice or within the industry on very prestigious projects where people have appropriated the work. And sometimes those who were working on the same project, who would be helped by this person, would then publish the project without mentioning the person who's actually done the project. So that's just a comment, I guess another experience to think about, which I'm sure many people can relate to, appropriation of work and then being excluded from it. I would like to move on to Ibrahim, who had a question. It'd be great if you could ask the panel yourself.
Hi everyone, thanks Umi and Neba for putting this on. It's an excellent panel and much needed conversation. My question is that recently we've seen a lot of practices engage with the Black Lives Movement through social media and by posting kind of black squares in solidarity or posting statements. But how do we engage practices to make more meaningful change beyond performative allyship? And my question in a way is directed to the guest listeners, but I will direct it to Joseph.
I guess, I don't know how to make them put pressure on. I guess make people feel uncomfortable, make it something that actually is part of their accountability as a professional organization. You know, the architects are not artists, they're professionals. They're governed by equality laws, they're governed by, they have, they're part of a system that is actually supposed to, obviously doesn't, but it's supposed to govern like sort of good behavior and ethical behavior. And a lot of them just fail on it miserably. And again, just don't let them make it more complex than it is. Hire some black people, hire some Asian people, promote them, pay them right, and don't treat them like shit when they work for you. And I can say I've been lucky that the places I've worked, I've always felt very included and always felt part of the community there. But again, I have a perspective on the fact that I am a mixed race guy. I'm a guy, I drink, I'm happy to go for after work drinks. I like fit into their, like that sort of, I fit into the culture of architecture quite well. But for people that don't, I can imagine it feeling quite isolated and quite lonely. So it's just a case of just like, let's see what all their websites look like in 6 months' time. In one of my times when I was had a bit more energy, I screenshotted, like I have a thing called like white people in meetings, where every time I'm in an online meeting, I just screenshot it. It just, why not? And then I've started doing just architecture practices, just like going onto their like homepages, clicking on directors, just screenshotting it. And let's see in 6 months if any of those pictures change. Because I think what is really noticeable to me, we've been talking about this for a few months now, but there's actually been no significant change. The board of trustees are still as white as they were. The directors of the companies are still as white as they were. The frameworks are still as white as they were. The people winning work are still as white as they were. People writing articles about architecture are still as white as they were. So all this chat, there's actually not been very much change. I think we have to just get ready and just say, we're going to just keep holding you to account.
Thank you, Joseph. I think we are now towards the end of our event. So what we'll do is actually open up the floor to our keynote listeners to come in. Before we do so, I just would like to ask a question for the keynote listeners. In the meantime, while Umi is picking up the slide. So the question is asking practice directors in the audience, what do they perceive as barriers to more people of color in senior positions in practice? So I'm just going to leave that out there for the keynote listeners to possibly pick up, and then Umi will introduce them. Thank you.
Anyone want to put their hand up, keynote listeners, to respond?
I'm not a keynote listener, but I'm happy to make a comment. My name's Harriet Miller. I'm Managing Director at David Chipperfield Architects, and our big barrier is that I have a lot of senior white male guys. I started in September 2018 and went to lunch with the directors and associate directors. I was the only woman amongst 14 people, and there was no BAME people at the table at all. So I know one of my challenges is the fact that I can't fire half of my associate directors to make space to promote people. And so I am acutely aware that this is a task, to your point, Joseph, that I need to be held account to for a long time. This is not going to happen overnight, but you're absolutely right. How have I addressed our gender balance in the office? I've hired some women. How will I address a lack of representation of BAM people in the office? Hire. And that is quite simply how you fix it. It is to take action and not to have a working group, although we've got one. So you're right. But I also was very aware of Tara's comments that we need to be an appealing place to work. And when candidates are looking at our website, they are seeing a website full of white, male, mostly middle-aged guys. And that's not an appealing environment for a lot of people.
Thank you, Harriet. I think
my son.
Can I say something? Got a comment.
Yeah, please.
So please go ahead, Paul.
Oh, hi. Thanks, Umi. Wow, what an evening. Thank you to the other speakers. The words were incredibly profound, and I've certainly learned a huge amount tonight. Picking up on the previous speaker from DCA, it is obviously a challenge if you've got 10 or 12 associates and senior associates. It is a difficult one. David though used to work for us many years ago, and maybe if he hadn't left, he would be in that sort of senior role now within our practice. It's obviously very unfortunate that he did leave. I think what I would see as a sort of a barrier. There's obviously lots of emerging practices out there. I think the biggest barrier at the moment is probably procurement for new entries into our world. And I think without procurement change, it's going to be a very slow road to anything really happening within the built environment sort of professions. So I think it's I don't want to pass the buck, but I think it is up to the big public institutions to change procurement law and rules and guidance in the next months and years to allow more emerging practices to come through. I think from a practice perspective, we are trying to get out there with A-level students, trying to advise on where to study, how to shape their portfolios, helping students pick the better universities. I think Pedro's comment was incredibly pertinent on that point. And then also if choosing a postgraduate place to study as well, trying to encourage them to study in the best possible place and improve their chances later on. And yeah, it's you know, I can imagine for the next 15 or 20 years in practice, this is going to become a bigger thing for our studio, and we will try and endeavour to do whatever we can.
Before we carry on with this part of, I'm just mindful that not everyone who's in the session will know what this kind of what the keynote listener concept is about. So we kind of managed to jump directly through that, but I'll just do a little quick, you know, a description, just so that everyone's aware of what what this part of the session's about. So we've got keynote listeners today from 12 organisations with us. And they've been invited to listen intently and now to contribute. That could be in a comment, a pledge, a commitment, or simply a reflection. I'm mindful that we're already over time, so if any of those people do want to make any further comments, I would recommend it, you know, it needs to be like a one-liner, and then we can move into the informal space. I'm just mindful that people have families and lives, so don't want to be on Zoom forever. But yeah, so we've got our keynote listeners today include directors and leaders from AHMM, KCA, the Bartlett, Allies+Morrison, Morrison Company, the NLA, MAKE, Southwark Council, Gestico and Wiles, the RIBA, Central St Martin's, and Studio Egret West. So all the keynote listeners, you should now all be unmuted. So you can either just wave your hand or raise your hand with the icon, and you will have 30 seconds approximately to just give us a quick reflection or commitment or whatever you want to do. And then anyone else who's able to stay on a little bit longer, we'll be moving over to the next session shortly, in about maybe say like 3 or 4 minutes. So Bob, please welcome. Thank you.
Well, I mean, obviously it's an incredibly sort of sobering listen the last hour, and I must say deeply depressing really. I can't believe the things that have been said. I mean, the thing I go away with is that I guess in a practice like ours, I assume that we're all doing the right thing. And I think when I hear what I've heard tonight, I have to go back and assume that everybody's not doing the right thing. And, you know, we probably have to look at this much more seriously than we do. I just want to say one thing really, is that our practice is pretty good in terms of the male-female balance. We have a woman managing partner, a quarter of our partners have been women. But when the gender pay gap documentation became a requirement, it was, again, it was a sort of shock to us all, and it has had an effect on the way the practice works. And I think there's some kind of thing about transparency and documentation, which is really helpful. And one thing I think you might think about is whether you could establish a kind of protocol for things like the interviewing process in architects' practices, where we really do record the people who apply to us, we record the people we interview, we record how we make the decisions, and we document that process. Because I think these things have to become much more explicit in order that people understand what they're doing and begin to make the changes that are quite obviously so necessary.
Thank you, Bob. Peter, I don't know if you want to say your piece, please.
Yes, okay, I'll say it quickly. I was very moved by all the stories I heard, and particularly listening to Joseph, with whom I've worked in the past. And I'd like to ask him a question, because what we do at NA is about debate and discussion. And we have actually set up a diversity panel. Now, he'll probably, I think he said he'd kick people down the stairs if they set up another panel. Now, I'm not quite sure how he thinks we should react as an organisation which is involved in debate, and I'd like his advice on that, because clearly we want to respond. We are certainly looking to change our hiring practices to make sure we do things better in the future, but also in terms of our general activities, what should we do to bring people together to try and sort this out?
I have lots of ideas, but you can hire me on a very good day rate, and I will be happy to consult and give them to you.
Okay, done.
Do any of the other keynote listeners want to?
Yeah, I'm happy just to make a few comments.
Thank you. If you just introduce yourself quickly as well.
Sorry, yes, I'm Simon Allford. I'm a founder of AHMM, four white men who met at university and opened an office shortly afterwards. I caught up last night by watching the previous event you did, and Neil Pinder spoke about non-traditional, and he didn't like the category BAME. And obviously, I, like Bob, and I'm sure most others, were shocked to hear and listen to the video you've laid at the beginning, and the crudeness of the kind of racism that was evidenced in people's experience. I'm also very aware of people kind of saying they'll do something and not doing it. I think a bit like Bob, gender pay gap was an important moment for us because there were four men who founded the business. In my review of that, which was, I was involved in the review, but it was led by a woman, Portuguese, Chinese woman in the office. What we thought was, it was really not really about gender pay gap, although that is a particular thing we have to do by law. It was about diversity. And I think Bob's right. We're doing some work with a group called The Other Box to see how we can improve what we do. We did a survey recently, and I was sort of pleasantly surprised to find that 15% of the staff identified themselves as BAME. But that's just what happens over time if things are going in the right way and if you set up the right culture. The biggest thing we can do, all of us, I think, is to go into education, to open it up to underprivileged people, many of whom might be identified as BAME, to try and say, this profession is open to people like you and it is not an exclusive club. But then the next thing we've got to do is make sure that if they do get interested in the profession, it doesn't look at long hours and low pay and bad treatment. And that's regardless of anything else. That's one of its biggest problems. That to make it something that when you get into it, you are adequately rewarded for the time and effort you put in. So I think it is a long journey, but it starts in schools and it starts in a change in architectural culture. And that is actually all about not having interns who are unpaid, etc., long hours, bad maternity leave and pay and this kind of thing. So it is a cultural shift. And that also means, and a number of your speakers have mentioned this, not doing work for free and not, in this current recession, getting on the chase to the lowest possible number. And that is what the profession does. And that makes it terrible for everyone, but particularly for people from underprivileged backgrounds. So you've got to start in primary and secondary schools, reach out, make the profession appear open, and then when they get through it, make university education affordable, apprenticeships and other things, and then say, and when you get there, it's worth all the bloody effort. Because that's the problem. When you get there, people aren't treating people properly. Joe.
Thank you. Shall I jump in?
Please.
Thank you. Well, that was amazing. I'm going to try and be relatively quick. So I guess what I've reflected on thinking about through this event now, through the experience of the last few days, weeks, months, is to acknowledge that our egos often get the better of us, often mistakenly making the content about us. And so where I sit and those in my position, I guess as the kind of keynote listeners, is about listening. That we collectively need to find a greater focus and trust on being open through listening. So Ellie's in the room with me, and we've been talking about this over the last few nights, this whole idea about how do you become part of the change. You can't do it from within with a different experience. You have to basically engage with the experience of others. And so I guess 7 points popped up through this debate that perhaps the key listeners might reflect upon. And the first one is about stop being right, understand others, be open to difference. The second point is to listen. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, so that we can listen twice as much as we can speak. Stop hogging the conversation. Perhaps we are brilliant, but guess what? People aren't that interested. Stop one-upmanship. Stop competing and stop lecturing. Ask questions. We should view each person as an exquisite opportunity for knowledge. Embrace active listening. Employ an attitude of paraphrasing back in discussion what you've heard from others as a means to be extremely focused on the experience of others. And to do this, you need to listen deeply. And reciprocity is important. We all have stories, but we need to find the moment to share our experience with others, whilst remembering it's not about you. And by that, I mean me. So my pledge is to listen more, to listen deeply, and to act on listening.
Thank you, Joe. That's obviously this is what it's all about. We've had a comment that I would like to read out. So it says, it's interesting to see large practice directors here, but given that a large number of architectural practices are SMEs, probably more prone to dangerous racial abuses in the workplace, it would be interesting to discuss this culture. It's normally couched in, oh, so and so doesn't fit into our office culture. What does that mean? No, seriously, what does that mean? A question to the BAME audience members: how many work in large practices because how many can't work in large practices because they got sick of the bullying, racial abuse of small practices with no oversight? So I guess I'm not sure exactly who that question is directed to, but I don't know whether either the panel or anyone in the audience wants to kind of, or the keynote listeners want to respond to that. And I think that will have to be our last kind of response before we move over into the other session, just because I'm aware that everyone's got families and we don't want to, yeah.
I'd like to, Umi, can I come in here?
Yes,
if that's okay. It's not quite a direct response to what you said. It's more the kind of response to the entire event, and quite a few events that I've been at like this in the last 5 or 6 weeks. We need to be is to admit failure and how profound that failure has been. And it's not just about saying we got to change. I don't think we've even begun to understand the level of change we need to make. So admitting failure is the first place to be. Listening, as Joe is saying, is absolutely essential. But I felt a profound sense of failure in the last 2 months, listening to meetings like this. I've been in several with hundreds, one meeting with 900 people in it, listening to the most profoundly moving and disturbing accounts of experiences. And it feels to me nothing has changed in my lifetime on this issue. And that's a complete and utter profound level of failure. So let's accept that. It hasn't been happening somewhere else. It's been happening here in our space, the spaces that we occupy. So I feel over the last few weeks, a profound sense of needing to recalibrate how we would measure change, how we would measure success. We are in a business that is very, very proficient at measuring success. I represent a school that does that at a very high level. We're obsessed with our success. Do we talk about our failures? No, we don't. And this is something that has to start now. We have to start talking about the things we've failed at and start talking about how we're going to correct them. Because you can't really talk about success anymore without accepting your failures. So I think that's the point I want to bring into this discussion, is drawing a line, saying we've failed, and starting again.
I think that's a brilliant closing remark for this event. We are very, very much over time, so I'm just going to pass it back finally on to Neba to do the final kind of thank yous and closing up the event. So thank you again for everyone that's been so generous and contributed, to the keynote listeners, to our amazing panelists, and just everyone who's kind of taken the time to join us today and be part of a commitment to make change.
Thank you, Umi. Just wanted to say also I love Joseph's background, giving me us all a bit of joy. So to close, I'd like to thank our panelists very much for your contributions. We know they're very personal accounts, and it's not always easy to talk publicly about these things. So it's greatly appreciated. Of course, to our contributors for the audio piece, and also the audience for coming in, and finally also Keynote listeners for taking the time and being open to this conversation and putting yourself out there. So just to close, we at BFA are a voluntary organization, and therefore we heavily rely both on cost recovery fees and or donations. And during the Black Lives Matter movement, we received many donations, which we are very grateful for. Your donations are going to help make sure that we can pay our members for any opportunities they get involved with representing BFA. And that might be in terms of advocacy, internships, placements, or project opportunities. So we are now going to share a link for the after event space if anyone would like to continue talking about this. If you'd like to be continue to be involved in the research that Umi and I have started about decolonizing architecture, there's a link there on the website, on our website. We'd also love it if you could give us any feedback that you might have, and we have a feedback form which we'll also put into the chat. And yeah, thank you so much. I'm just going to share the link in a moment. So the first link is the link to our other Zoom chat. And then the second one is for the feedback form. So thank you very much.
Thank you.